My son beat me up just because the soup wasn't salted. The next morning he said, "My wife is coming for lunch. Cover everything up and smile." Then he went to the office, and when he entered his boss's room he turned as pale as chalk. Before we continue, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. Now let me tell you my story. My house in Lincoln Park has always been a place of quiet order. It's a classic Chicago brownstone, narrow and tall, with a postage stamp garden out back that I've coaxed into a riot of color every summer for 40 years. For most of that time, the quiet was a gentle, comforting thing, the peaceful backdrop to a life filled with the happy chaos of raising a son and loving a husband. Now the quiet is different. It's a brittle, fragile thing, a thin sheet of ice I find myself walking on every single day, terrified of making a sound that might crack it. I am Martha Green, 62 years old, and for 4 decades I was a teacher. I taught second grade at a little elementary school a few blocks from here. My life was a symphony of finger paints, scraped knees, and the magical explosive moment a child learns to read. I was good at it. I was patient. I knew how to handle a classroom of unruly 7-year-olds, with a gentle word and a warm, steady presence. I prided myself on my ability to create a space of safety and kindness. It is the great, tragic irony of my life that I have failed so spectacularly to do the same in my own home. Since my husband Robert passed 2 years ago, the house has felt both too big and terrifyingly small. My son Jonathan moved in a year ago. On the surface it was a gesture of love. "I can't have you rattling around in this big old house by yourself, Mom," he had said, his voice full of the charming, filial concern he was so good at projecting. He was a successful corporate lawyer, my brilliant, handsome boy, and I was so proud, so grateful. I thought it was a new beginning for us. In reality, it was the beginning of my imprisonment. The man I see at home is not the charismatic, confident Jonathan the world sees. The Jonathan who comes home to me is a man stretched taut as a piano wire, his eyes dark with a stress that seems to radiate from him in waves. He is a perfectionist, a man for whom a crooked picture frame or a spot on a water glass is not a minor annoyance, but a personal affront, a sign of a world spinning out of his control. And so I spend my days in a state of quiet, constant vigilance. I clean, I cook, I organize. I try to make his home life a perfect, frictionless sanctuary, a calm harbor against the storms of his high-powered career. I walk on eggshells. I make myself small. The patient, confident teacher who could command a room of 30 children has been replaced by a quiet, anxious woman who is terrified of her own son's moods. My love for him, a vast and unconditional thing, has become a cage, and I have willingly, foolishly, locked myself inside it. The storm I had been sensing all week finally broke on a Tuesday. The day was cold and gray, a classic Chicago autumn day with a wind that cut like a knife off the lake. Jonathan had called me earlier, his voice clipped and furious, ranting about a deal that had fallen through, a senior partner who had undermined him, a mistake made by a junior associate that he was now taking the blame for. It was a familiar litany of grievances, the sound of a man whose perfect, curated world was not behaving as it should. I knew he would be coming home angry. I decided to make his favorite comfort food, homemade chicken noodle soup, the kind my own mother used to make for me when I was sick. The recipe was a tactile memory, a thing of love and care. I spent the afternoon simmering the broth, hand-shredding the chicken, chopping the vegetables into a perfect uniform dice. The whole house filled with the warm, savory, and deeply comforting aroma. It was a smell that said, "You are safe, you are loved." It was a lie, but it was a beautiful one. He came home just after 9. The moment he walked in the door, I felt the temperature in the house drop by 20 degrees. He didn't greet me. He just dropped his heavy leather briefcase by the door with a thud that echoed in the quiet house, loosened his silk tie and stalked into the dining room. "Is dinner ready?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He didn't look at me. He was staring at the perfectly set table as if looking for a flaw. "Yes, honey," I said, my voice a little too bright, a little too eager to please. "I made your favorite chicken noodle soup. Just let me get you a bowl." I bustled into the kitchen, my heart thumping a nervous, frantic rhythm against my ribs. I ladled the golden, fragrant soup into a bowl, my hands trembling slightly. I was so focused on the presentation, on making sure the carrots and celery were perfectly distributed, that I forgot the final, most crucial step. A simple, stupid, and catastrophic oversight. I placed the bowl in front of him, along with a plate of fresh, crusty bread. He picked up his spoon without a word. He dipped it into the soup, lifted it to his lips, and took a single deliberate sip. His face, which had been a mask of cold, controlled fury, suddenly contorted. He didn't just frown. His features twisted into a snarl of pure, visceral disgust. He set the spoon down with a sharp metallic click. "There's no salt," he said. His voice was not loud, it was a whisper, a sound more terrifying than any shout. It was the sound of a predator, calm and focused, just before the strike. "Oh," I said, my blood running cold. "Oh, Jonathan, I'm so sorry. I was so busy I must have completely forgotten. Let me just get the shaker." "You forgot?" he repeated, his voice still a whisper but now laced with a venom that was almost reptilian. "You had one job, one simple job, to make a simple bowl of soup, and you couldn't even do that right." He stood up from the table. I flinched, instinctively recoiling. And then, he moved. It was not the clumsy, angry shove of a man losing his temper. It was a motion of shocking, brutal efficiency. He didn't yell, he didn't scream, he simply drew his hand back, and with a cold, dispassionate force he backhanded me across the face. The force of the blow was stunning. It snapped my head to the side, and a universe of bright, flashing stars exploded behind my eyes. The sound was a sharp, wet crack that echoed in the silent, perfect dining room. I stumbled backward, my legs giving out, and collapsed to the floor, a crumpled heap of shock and pain. I lay there on the polished hardwood, the scent of chicken soup and my own coppery blood filling my nostrils. A sharp, searing pain was blossoming in my cheek, my eye, my very soul. I looked up at my son. He was standing over me, his hand still slightly raised, his face not one of rage, but of a cold, terrifying and absolute satisfaction, as if he had finally perfectly restored order to his world. The silence that followed the blow was more profound, more terrifying than the violence itself. It was a dead, airless silence, broken only by the sound of my own ragged, painful breathing on the floor. The beautiful, fragrant soup, the product of a long afternoon of love and care, sat on the table, its steam rising in a graceful, mocking curl. Jonathan did not move. He just stood over me, his chest rising and falling, his expression utterly unreadable. The brief, satisfying flash of rage had passed, and what was left was not remorse, not guilt, not even concern. What was left was a cold, pragmatic annoyance. He looked at me, at the sprawling 62-year-old woman on his dining room floor, at the blood trickling from my lip, at the already purpling bloom of the bruise on my cheek, and he saw not his mother but a problem, a messy, inconvenient complication in his perfectly curated life. He did not offer me a hand. He did not ask if I was okay. He did not for a single, solitary second show a flicker of the humanity I had spent my entire life believing he possessed. He simply walked around me, his expensive Italian shoes silent on the polished floor, and went into the kitchen. I heard the sound of water running, and he returned a moment later with a handful of paper towels. He didn't offer them to me. He knelt down not to tend to my injuries, but to meticulously wipe a tiny, almost invisible splatter of soup from the leg of his trousers. "Look at this mess," he muttered, his voice a low, aggrieved growl. "Look at what you've made me do." The words were a masterclass in psychological cruelty. It was not his violence that was the problem. It was my failure, my unsalted soup, my clumsiness in falling, my mess on his floor. The blame, in his twisted, self-serving universe, was entirely, completely mine. I just lay there, my cheek pressed against the cool, unforgiving wood, and I felt something inside me begin to die. It was the part of me that had always made excuses for him. The part that had told myself his temper was just a product of stress, that his coldness was just a sign of his ambition. The part that had believed with a fierce, unwavering and deeply foolish maternal love, that my good, kind boy was still in there somewhere, just hidden beneath the layers of a difficult life. That part of me shriveled and turned to ash in the face of his cold, clinical indifference. The man standing before me was not my son. He was a monster, a stranger with my son's face. He finished cleaning his trousers, tossed the used paper towels onto the table, and finally looked at me. "Get up," he said, his voice flat, devoid of all emotion. It was not a request, it was an order. "Go to your room, I'll clean this up." Slowly, painfully, I began to move. Every muscle in my body ached, but the physical pain was a distant, irrelevant echo compared to the profound, soul-deep agony of my shattered heart. I used the leg of a dining room chair to pull myself up, my movements stiff and clumsy, like an old, broken doll. I did not look at him. I could not bear to see the face of the stranger who had just beaten me. I hobbled out of the dining room and up the grand, curving staircase, Each step a fresh wave of pain and shame. I could hear him behind me, the sound of him calmly, efficiently, clearing the table, scraping the uneaten soup into the garbage disposal, erasing the evidence of the love I had tried to offer him. I reached my bedroom, my sanctuary, and closed the door. I leaned against the cool wood, my body trembling with a violent, uncontrollable shudder. I looked at myself in the full-length mirror on the closet door, and for the first time I saw the truth. The woman in the mirror was not just a retired teacher, a loving mother, she was a victim, a battered woman, hiding in her own room in her own house, and the monster she was hiding from was her own son. I did not sleep. The night was a long, dark tunnel of pain and terror. I lay in my bed, my body a constellation of aches, and listened to the sounds of the house. I heard the faint murmur of the television from downstairs, the clinking of a glass, the normal domestic sounds of a life that was no longer normal at all. He was down there, my son, my assailant, probably watching a basketball game, the violent, brutal act he had just committed already forgotten, a minor inconvenient blip in his evening. For him it was over, for me it was just beginning. The physical pain was immense, but it was the emotional whiplash that was truly devastating. How does a mind reconcile 40 years of love and devotion with the stark, brutal reality of a closed fist? My memories of him as a child, a sweet, gap-toothed boy who used to bring me dandelions, were now overlaid with the image of his face, twisted in a snarl of cold, adult rage. The two images warred in my mind, a chaotic, schizophrenic slideshow of love and violence. Sometime after midnight, the house fell silent. He had gone to bed. I finally carefully made my way to the bathroom. The face that stared back at me from the mirror was a stranger's. My left eye was swollen almost shut, the skin around it a grotesque, puffy landscape of angry purple and blue. My lip was split, dried blood crusted at the corner of my mouth. I looked like a woman who had been in a car wreck. I looked like a woman who had been beaten. Which of course I had. I spent the rest of the night in a state of quiet, frozen shock. What was I supposed to do? Who could I tell? The shame was a thick, suffocating blanket. To admit what my son had done would be to admit my own profound, catastrophic failure as a mother. It would be to expose our perfect, curated family as a lie, a dark, violent charade. And so, I did what so many women in my situation do. I did nothing. I chose silence. The next morning the sun rose, a cheerful, indifferent orange on a world that felt broken and wrong. I stayed in my room, too afraid, too ashamed, to go downstairs. Around 8 o'clock I heard his footsteps on the stairs. A pause outside my door. My heart seized in my chest. Then a sharp, authoritative knock. "Mom!" His voice, calm and businesslike, came through the door. "Open up. We need to talk." With a trembling hand, I unlocked the door. He was standing there, already dressed for work in an impeccable razor-sharp suit, a cup of coffee in his hand. He looked fresh, rested, powerful. He looked like nothing had happened. He didn't look at my face. His eyes were fixed on a point just over my shoulder. His expression was not one of remorse or apology. It was one of grim and patient resolve. He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. "Victoria is coming for lunch," he said, his voice flat, devoid of all emotion. "Here, at noon." I just stared at him, my mind unable to process the sheer, breathtaking audacity of the statement. His wife, my daughter-in-law, a woman obsessed with appearances, with perfection. She was coming here to this house to see this face. "She's trying to help me land the Davenport partnership," he continued, his voice a low, menacing monotone. "Her father is an old friend of one of the senior partners. This lunch is important. It's about cementing the image of a stable, supportive, perfect family, an image that is crucial for my career right now." He finally looked at my face. His eyes, for the first time, registered the full, ugly extent of the damage he had done. He saw the swollen eye, the split lip, the grotesque, purple bruise, but what I saw in his eyes was not horror, or guilt, or even a flicker of pity. What I saw was a cold, pragmatic and utterly terrifying calculation. He was assessing a problem, a logistical challenge that needed to be solved. He took a step closer and my body instinctively flinched away from him. "You will go downstairs," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, a sound that was more chilling than any shout. "You will go into the bathroom, you will find your makeup, you will cover that up, you will cover all of it up, and when Victoria arrives, you will come out, you will sit at the table and you will smile, you will be the charming, doting mother-in-law she expects you to be. You will not limp, you will not wince, You will not say a single solitary word about what happened last night. He leaned in closer, his face just inches from mine, and his voice was the sound of a snake. Don't you dare ruin this for me. The command was absolute. It was not a request, it was the threat of a tyrant, the order of a monster who had just realized the full extent of his power over me. He had broken my body, and now he was demanding that I help him conceal the crime. He was making me his accomplice. After Jonathan left for the office, a ghost of his expensive cologne lingering in the hallway, I was left alone in the silent sunlit house with his monstrous command echoing in my ears. Cover everything up and smile. The sheer chilling narcissism of it was a thing of almost clinical purity. He had not just brutalized me, he was now demanding that I become the curator of my own deception, the makeup artist for his perfect fraudulent life. I stood before the mirror in my bathroom, the bright, unforgiving light revealing the full, grotesque extent of the image. The bruise had deepened overnight, a hideous mottled galaxy of purple blue and an angry, sickly yellow. My eye was swollen to a slit, my lip a puffy, painful line. This was not a thing that could be easily hidden. This was a billboard of his violence. My first instinct, the instinct of the woman I used to be, the proud, strong teacher, was to rebel, to refuse. To let Victoria arrive and see the raw, unvarnished truth of what her husband had done. Let her see the monster she had married. Let the whole perfect curated world come crashing down around them. It would be an act of defiance, an act of truth. But then, another colder and far more powerful instinct took over. The instinct of survival. I thought of the look in his eyes when he had given me his command. It was not the look of an angry son. It was the look of a man who had crossed a line and had discovered he had no intention of ever going back. It was the look of a man who had realized that violence worked. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the very marrow of my bones, that if I defied him the consequences would be far, far worse than a split lip. Last night, he had been angry about soup. If I ruined this important lunch, what would he be angry about then? My very life, fear, cold and sharp, won the battle. I was a prisoner and my first duty was to appease the warden. And so, my performance began. I opened my makeup bag, a small floral print thing filled with the simple, age-appropriate cosmetics of a retired school teacher. It felt like opening a box of surgical instruments. My hands were trembling as I began the painstaking, humiliating process of trying to erase my own assault. I started with a thick yellow-toned concealer, dabbing it gently around the edges of the bruise, trying to neutralize the angry purple. The skin was exquisitely tender, and with every touch, a fresh, hot wave of pain shot through my cheekbone. I flinched, tears welling in my eyes, blurring my vision. This was not just makeup. This was an act of profound, intimate violation. A second assault. I was being forced to touch, to tend to the very wounds he had inflicted. I layered on a heavy full-coverage foundation, my movements slow and deliberate, the familiar feel of the sponge on my skin, now alien and grotesque. I was not applying makeup to enhance my features. I was applying a mask, a thick, beige paste-like mask of lies. I worked for nearly an hour, blending, patting, setting with powder, my bathroom counter becoming a chaotic palette of flesh-toned creams and powders. When I was finished I stared at my reflection, and I felt a wave of dizzying, disorienting nausea. The woman in the mirror was a stranger. She was a smooth, placid, and utterly false creature. The bruise was still there, of course, a lumpy, swollen continent of pain beneath the carefully applied topography of makeup, but its violent colors had been muted to a dull, shadowy suggestion. From a distance in the soft, forgiving light of the dining room, I might just pass for human, but it was the eyes that betrayed the lie. The eyes were hollow, haunted things, swimming with a terror and a grief that no amount of concealer could ever hide. So, I applied a thick, bright line of eyeliner and 2 coats of mascara, a desperate, pathetic attempt to draw attention away from the sorrow within. And then the final, most difficult part of the costume, the smile. I stood before the mirror and I practiced. I forced the corners of my mouth to turn up. The expression was a grotesque, painful rictus, a clown's smile painted on a mask of tragedy. My split lips screamed in protest. I smiled again, and again. I practiced until the muscles in my face ached with the effort, until the smile was a detached, mechanical thing I could summon on command. It was the smile of a hostage. I was ready. The mask was in place. The performance was rehearsed. I was no longer Martha Green. I was an actress, about to take the stage in the most important and most terrifying role of my life. The happy, loving mother of a monster. While I was in my quiet, sunlit home, painstakingly constructing a mask of lies out of foundation and fear. My son Jonathan was engaged in his own act of transformation. He walked out of the front door of our brownstone, leaving the silent, simmering horror of his domestic life behind him, and by the time he stepped out of his black luxury sedan and into the gleaming granite and glass lobby of his downtown law firm, he was a different man. The monster was gone. In his place was Jonathan Green, Esquire, charismatic, ambitious, a rising star in the cutthroat world of corporate law. He strode through the lobby, his head held high, a confident, easy smile on his face. He greeted the security guard by name. He shared a brief, witty remark with a fellow lawyer by the elevators. He was a portrait of success, a man completely at ease in his world of power and prestige. The ability to compartmentalize, I've read, is a key trait of the sociopath. To be able to commit an act of brutal violence and then, hours later, to move through the world as if nothing has happened, without a flicker of guilt or a tremor of remorse. It is a terrifying and inhuman skill, and my son, I was beginning to realize, possessed it in abundance. His office on the 80th floor of a skyscraper that pierced the Chicago clouds was a testament to the life he had built, the image he had so carefully curated. It was a corner office, a prize he had fought for, with a breathtaking panoramic view of Lake Michigan. The furniture was sleek, modern, and brutally expensive. On his desk there were no sentimental family photos. There was only a single framed photograph of him and Victoria at a glamorous charity ball, the two of them a perfect, smiling power couple. His world was not built on a foundation of love or connection, but on a foundation of image and ambition. He spent his morning in a series of high-stakes meetings. His mind, which had been so consumed with the problem of his mother just hours before, now completely focused on the intricate, merciless dance of corporate negotiation. He was by all accounts brilliant at his job. He was ruthless, he was persuasive, and he had an almost preternatural ability to spot the weakness in an opponent's argument and exploit it without mercy. They were the very same skills he had used on me. At 10 a.m. he had his weekly team meeting. He presided over it with his usual easy authority, praising one junior associate for a well-written brief, gently but firmly critiquing another for a missed deadline. He was a leader, a mentor, a man his colleagues respected and slightly feared. None of them, not a single person in that room, could have ever imagined that the hand he was using to point at a chart on the screen was the same hand that had just hours before struck his own mother to the floor. The compartmentalization was absolute. The violent, tyrannical man who had beaten his mother over a bowl of unsalted soup did not exist in this gleaming 80th floor world. That man had been locked away in a soundproof room in Jonathan's mind, a monster kept safely out of sight. The only person in this building who had ever seen that monster was Jonathan himself. And me. His final meeting of the morning, the one that was the source of all his pressure, all his ambition, was the one he had been preparing for all week. It was his final pitch for a full partnership, a presentation he would be making to the firm's legendary senior managing partner, Mr. Charles Davenport. He spent the last hour before the meeting in his office, alone, going over his notes, his face a mask of intense, focused concentration. This was the culmination of his entire career. This was the moment that would validate his entire existence, that would finally, in his mind, make him the success he had always so desperately wanted to be. As he straightened his tie in the reflection of his office window, the city of Chicago sprawling beneath him like a kingdom at his feet, he was not thinking about his mother. He was not thinking about her bruised face, or the fear in her eyes. He was thinking only of his own ascent. He was a man on the verge of becoming a king, and he was utterly, completely oblivious to the fact that his entire carefully constructed kingdom was about to be brought down by a single desperate phone call from a quiet little brownstone in Lincoln Park. The monster, he believed, was safely locked away. He had no idea it had already been seen. After I had finished applying my mask of lies, the house was too quiet, too full of the ghosts of the previous night. The silence seemed to amplify the sound of my own frantic, terrified thoughts. I needed to do something, to engage in some mundane physical task that would allow me to feel a semblance of control over my own life. I decided to clean. I started in the living room, dusting the bookshelves, polishing the silver-framed photographs. Each photo was a small, painful stab to the heart. There was Jonathan, age 7, a gap-toothed grin on his face, holding up a string of fish he'd caught with his father. There he was at his high school graduation, his arm around me, his face full of a proud, uncomplicated love. Where had that boy gone? How had he turned into the cold, cruel stranger who had hurt me? My cleaning became a frantic, almost manic search for an answer, for a clue I had missed. I found myself in the small cluttered storage room in the attic, a place I hadn't been in years. The air was thick with the smell of dust and cedar, and forgotten time. The room was a jumble of old furniture, holiday decorations and stacked, unlabeled boxes, a chaotic archive of a life I had once lived. I was looking for a box of old tablecloths when my hand brushed against a different box, a small, unassuming cardboard box tucked away under a pile of old blankets. On the side, in my late husband Robert's familiar, elegant script, were 2 words, old friend. Curiosity, a welcome distraction from my fear, took over. I pulled the box out and opened it. Inside was a jumble of old photographs, letters and university memorabilia from a time before me, from Robert's life as a young, ambitious law professor. I sifted through the photos, smiling at the images of a young, handsome Robert with a full head of hair, surrounded by his adoring students. And then I saw it. It was a simple, framed photograph, the silver of the frame tarnished with age. The photo was of 2 men, standing on the steps of the University of Chicago Law School, their arms thrown around each other's shoulders in a gesture of easy, triumphant camaraderie. One of them was my Robert, looking proud and professorial. The other was a young man, a student, his face thin and hungry, his eyes burning with a fierce, brilliant intelligence. I knew that face. I had seen it in newspaper articles, in magazines, on the television news. It was a face that had aged, that had become more powerful, more imposing over the years, but it was unmistakably the same man. It was Charles Davenport, the legendary senior partner of the most powerful law firm in Chicago, Jonathan's boss. The sight of the photograph sent a jolt through me, a shock of recognition so profound it was almost a physical blow. A flood of memories, long dormant and forgotten, came rushing back. I remembered Robert coming home from the university, talking for hours about this one brilliant, scholarship student, a kid from the South Side with nothing to his name but a mind like a steel trap. "This one's going to be a star, Martha," he had said. "He's got the fire." I remembered the young man coming to our house for dinner, his clothes a little too small, his appetite immense. I remembered how he had talked about the law not as a profession but as a calling, a tool for justice. I remembered how Robert had mentored him, had spent hours helping him with his studies, had used his own connections to get him his first crucial summer clerkship. We had taken him under our wing. He had been for a few years like a second son to us. After he graduated, he had risen through the ranks of the Chicago legal world with meteoric speed. The dinners had become less frequent, the calls shorter. Life had happened. We had lost touch. I hadn't thought of him in years. I stared at the photograph, at the image of the 2 men, the mentor and his brilliant protege, and a desperate, wild, and utterly impossible idea began to form in my mind. It was a fool's hope, a desperate long shot from a woman with no other options. What was this man to me now? A strange, the powerful, unapproachable legal legend. What was I to him? The forgotten widow of his long-dead mentor. He probably wouldn't even remember me, but what if he did? What if the debt of gratitude he had once felt for my husband was not completely extinguished by the passage of time? I looked from the photograph to my own reflection in the dusty glass of the frame. I saw the hollow, haunted eyes, the faint, shadowy outline of the bruise beneath the layers of makeup. I was a desperate woman, and desperate women do desperate things. With a trembling hand I took out my cell phone. I took a picture of the photograph. And then, I did a quick frantic search for the main number of the law firm of Davenport, Finch & Associates. My heart was hammering, my mind screaming that this was insane, that he would never take my call, but it was the only move I had left to make. It was the only card I had left to play. Victoria arrived at precisely 12 o'clock, her timing as impeccable as her cream-colored Chanel suit. She glided into my home, a vision of effortless, expensive elegance, a fragrant cloud of some floral, citrusy perfume trailing in her wake. She was the very picture of the life my son had chosen, a life of polished surfaces and curated perfection. "Martha, darling," she said, her voice a low, melodious. She leaned in to give me an air kiss, her eyes for a fraction of a second flicking to the left side of my face, a quick, almost imperceptible assessment of my makeup job. She was not looking at me, she was inspecting the facade. "You look a little tired. Are you sure you're up for this?" The question was a masterpiece of passive aggression, a subtle reminder of my supposed fragility, my condition. "I'm perfectly fine, Victoria," I said, my practiced smile firmly in place. "I wouldn't miss our lunch for the world. Please, come in, I've made a quiche. I led her into the dining room, where I had set the table with my best china and silver. The room was filled with sunlight, the crystal glasses sparkling, the centerpiece of fresh-cut roses from my garden adding a touch of vibrant living color. It was a scene of perfect domestic tranquility, a perfect lot. The lunch was a tightrope walk, a high-stakes performance where a single misstep, a single flicker of the truth in my eyes, could mean disaster. I played the part of the slightly dotty but charming mother-in-law to perfection. I asked her about her event planning business. I complimented her on her suit. I made pleasant, meaningless small talk about the weather. Victoria, in turn, played her own part. She was the doting, patient daughter-in-law, listening to my rambling stories with a kind, condescending smile, gently guiding the conversation back when I lost my train of thought. The entire conversation was a grotesque parody of a normal family lunch. We were two actresses on a stage, playing to an audience of one another, each of us trying to sell a different fraudulent version of reality. "Jonathan is so brilliant," she said, taking a delicate bite of her quiche. "He's just been working so hard on this Davenport partnership. It's really the culmination of everything he's ever wanted. I'm so incredibly proud of him. He's always been ambitious." I agreed, my voice a warm maternal coo. "Ever since he was a little boy, he gets that from his father. Miss Davenport is a legend, of course," she continued, her eyes gleaming with the reflected light of her ambition. "To have him as a mentor, to be brought into that inner circle, it will change everything for us. The life we'll be able to have, the places we'll go. We're talking about a whole new level, Martha." She was not talking about my son's professional fulfillment. She was talking about money, about status, about the spoils of a victory she already considered won. All the while I could feel the invisible presence of Jonathan in the room, his chilling command hanging over my head like a guillotine. "Smile. Don't ruin this for me." And so I smiled. I smiled, until my face ached. I smiled, until the expression felt like a mask that had been surgically grafted to my skin. I poured her another glass of iced tea. My hand was perfectly steady. The teacher in me, the woman who had spent 40 years maintaining a calm, orderly classroom in the face of chaos, had taken over. I was managing the scene, controlling the narrative, giving the performance of a lifetime. Victoria was completely taken in. She saw me as a harmless, slightly senile old woman, a necessary but ultimately irrelevant piece of the family puzzle that she and Jonathan were about to take full control of. She was so confident in her own superiority, so blinded by her own greed, that she couldn't see the truth that was staring her right in the face. She couldn't see the cold, hard and utterly unforgiving resolve that was hardening in my eyes, right behind my warm, practiced and deeply fraudulent smile. The polite, brittle facade of our lunch was held together by the thinnest of threads, and it almost snapped halfway through the meal. We were talking about a recent charity gala Victoria had planned, a lavish affair for the city's elite. She was describing the floral arrangements, the string quartet, the ice sculpture in the shape of the corporate sponsor's logo. It was a world of performative generosity and tax-deductible glamour that felt a million miles away from my own. I was nodding along, my smile fixed in place, my mind a million miles away, replaying my desperate long-shot phone call to Mr. Davenport's office that morning. I had gotten through to his longtime executive assistant, a formidable woman with a voice like gravel. I had stated my name and the assistant had prepared to politely dismiss me, until I'd added the crucial phrase, "Please tell him it's Martha Green, Robert Green's wife, and tell him it's about a student he once knew." There had been a long pause and then the assistant's voice had changed, softened with a flicker of recognition. "Please hold, Mrs. Green," she had said. The next voice I heard was his. "Victoria, that sounds absolutely lovely," I said, snapping my attention back to the present. As I spoke, she reached across the table, a gesture of casual daughter-in-lawly affection, and placed her hand on my forearm. "You should have come, Martha," she said. "You would have loved it." The touch was light, almost imperceptible, but my body reacted before my mind could. I flinched. A sharp, violent and completely involuntary recoiling, as if her hand had been a hot coal. The memory of my son's hand, of the brutal, shocking impact, was still so raw, so close to the surface that the unexpected physical contact sent a jolt of pure animal panic through my nervous system. My breath hitched. The smile on my face faltered. For a split second, the mask of the calm, doting mother slipped, and the terrified, battered woman beneath was exposed. Victoria's hand drew back as if she'd been stung. Her eyes narrowed, her perfectly made-up face a mask of confusion and a flicker of something else. suspicion. The air in the room, which had been filled with her light, bright chatter, was suddenly thick with a new dangerous tension. "Martha," she said, her voice losing its warm, melodious quality, turning sharp and probing. "Are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." My mind raced, scrambling for a plausible lie, a way to repair the crack in the facade. My heart was hammering, a frantic drumbeat of panic. She had seen it. She had seen the truth in my eyes. It was in that moment that Jonathan walked through the door. He had come home from the office early, a surprise he had no doubt coordinated with Victoria to check on me, to make sure I was holding up my end of their monstrous bargain. He took in the scene at the dining room table. Me, frozen and pale, Victoria, her eyes narrowed with suspicion, and he understood immediately. I had slipped. I was ruining it. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. He simply looked at me from across the room, and his eyes were full of a cold, silent, and utterly terrifying command. The look was a physical thing, a shard of ice that shot across the room and into my heart. It said, "Fix this, now." It was not a plea. It was a threat. The fear, the raw primal fear of him, of what he was capable of, was a more powerful motivator than any lie I could have invented. It jolted me back into character. I let out a small theatrical cough, placing my hand on my chest. I gave Victoria a weak, embarrassed smile. "Oh my goodness," I said, my voice a little shaky, a little frail. You startled me, dear. My nerves haven't been the same since the fall. Sometimes the silliest little things can just set my heart to fluttering." I looked over at Jonathan, my eyes full of a pleading, "See how fragile I am," expression. "Jonathan, honey," I said, my voice quavering just enough. "You're home early." The explanation was flimsy, pathetic even, but in the context of the confused old woman narrative they had so carefully constructed, it was just plausible enough. Victoria's suspicion receded, replaced once again by that familiar condescending pity. She saw not a woman reacting to trauma, but a senile old lady with jumpy nerves. Jonathan's face relaxed. The silent, menacing threat in his eyes was replaced by a look of strained, loving concern. He walked over and placed a hand on my shoulder, his touch a proprietary, controlling gesture. "See, Victoria," he said, his voice a low, sorrowful murmur. "This is what I was talking about. We have to be so careful with her." I sat there, under the heavy weight of his hand, and I smiled my quiet hostage smile. The crisis had been averted. The performance was back on track, but the near slip had cost me. My heart was pounding. My hands were trembling under the table. I didn't know how much longer I could keep this up. The mask was cracking, and I was running out of time. The law offices of Davenport, Finch and Associates occupied the top 5 floors of a gleaming black glass skyscraper that dominated the Chicago skyline. The place was designed to intimidate, to project an aura of untouchable power and astronomical wealth. The lobby was a cavernous, echoing space of Italian marble and modern art, the air itself seeming to be filtered through money. Jonathan Green moved through this world as if he were born to it. He strode across the marble floor, his briefcase in hand, a confident, easy smile on his face. He was in his element. This was the validation for all of it. The pressure, the long hours, the sacrifices he had made at home. This was the prize. Today was the day. The culmination of a 15-year career, a relentless, single-minded climb up the corporate ladder. At 3 p.m., he would be walking into the office of Mr. Charles Davenport for his final partnership interview. It was, he knew, largely a formality. He had been mentored by one of the firm's most powerful rainmakers. His billable hours were legendary. He had a reputation for being a brilliant, ruthless litigator. The partnership was his. Today was just the coronation. He took the private high-speed elevator to the 80th floor, the executive floor, a hushed, rarefied world where the real power resided. The receptionist, a cool, elegant woman who had been with the firm for 30 years, gave him a small, knowing smile. "He's ready for you, Jonathan," she said. "Good luck." "Thank you, Margaret," he said, his own smile a mask of easy confidence. Inside, his heart was hammering. This was it. He walked down the long, carpeted hallway, the walls lined with framed, black and white photographs of the firm's founding partners, a gallery of stern, powerful men, who had shaped the legal landscape of the city. He stopped before a pair of massive, carved mahogany doors. A simple brass plaque read, "Charles Davenport, Senior Managing Partner." He took a deep breath, smoothed the front of his perfectly tailored suit, and knocked. "Come in." A deep, authoritative voice called from within. Jonathan opened the doors and stepped into the sanctum sanctorum. The office was vast, a corner suite, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking godlike view of the city and the lake. The room was decorated not with the cold modernism of Jonathan's own office, but with a timeless, old-world elegance. Rich leather armchairs, antique maps on the walls, and a desk the size of a small boat. Mr. Charles Davenport was not at his desk. He was standing by the window, his back to the door, looking out over the city he had, in many ways, conquered. At 67 he was a legend, a lion of the Chicago legal world, a man whose name commanded a level of respect that bordered on fear. "Jonathan," he said, his voice a low, powerful rumble, without turning around, "thank you for coming. Please, close the doors." Jonathan did as he was told, the heavy doors closing with a soft, definitive click, sealing them in the quiet, sunlit room. He stood in the middle of the vast office, feeling suddenly small, a supplicant before a king. "They say," Mr. Davenport mused, his gaze still fixed on the city below, "that from up here you can see the future, the new high-rises, the new developments, the relentless forward march of progress." He paused. "But I find, as I get older, that I am more interested in the past, in the foundations upon which all this newness is built, in the old debts, the old loyalties, the things that truly endure." He finally turned from the window. His face was a mask of chiseled, aristocratic features, his eyes a pale, piercing blue that seemed to look right through a person. His expression was not the warm, congratulatory look Jonathan had been expecting. It was unreadable. It was the face of a judge about to deliver a verdict. "Please, have a seat, Jonathan," he said, gesturing to one of the leather armchairs in front of his desk. "There's someone here I'd like you to see." Jonathan's blood ran cold. Someone here? He was supposed to be alone with Davenport. His mind raced. Was it another partner? A client? From a second, identical high-backed, leather chair that had been positioned with its back to the door, a chair Jonathan hadn't even registered in his nervousness, a figure began to turn. Slowly, silently, the chair swiveled around, and Jonathan saw her. It was his mother. The moment he saw me, the world seemed to stop on its axis for Jonathan. The confident, ambitious lawyer, the man on the verge of his greatest triumph, simply vanished. He was replaced by a pale, gawking boy, his face a mask of pure, uncomprehending shock. He just stood there, frozen in the middle of the vast office, his expensive leather briefcase slipping from his nerveless fingers and thudding softly onto the plush oriental rug. I did not smile. I did not speak. I simply looked at him, my expression calm, my gaze level. I was not the frail, bruised and terrified woman he had left in the brownstone that morning. I was not the dotty, confused old woman he had so confidently described to his wife. I was Martha Green, seated in a leather armchair in the most powerful office in Chicago, and I was here to collect a debt. I had spent the morning, not cowering in my house but here, in this office. Mr. Davenport had sent his personal car for me, a sleek black town car that had whisked me downtown with a quiet, anonymous efficiency. He had greeted me not as a pitiful old woman but as an honored guest, as the widow of his beloved mentor. He had listened to my story, his face growing darker and harder with every word I spoke. He had looked at the photograph of my bruised, swollen face, the one I had taken on my phone that morning, and his expression had turned to one of pure cold fury. Our conversation had not been one of a potential client to a lawyer. It was a council of war between two old allies, and we had planned our strategy with a meticulous legal precision. Now, Jonathan stood before us, a fly who had just flown into a spider's web he hadn't even known existed. "Mom?" He finally managed to whisper, the word a pathetic, strangled croak. "What? What are you doing here?" Before I could answer, Mr. Davenport spoke, his voice the sound of a closing crypt. "Your mother is here as my guest, Jonathan," he said, walking slowly from the window to stand behind his massive desk. He did not He stood, a tall, imposing figure of judgment, his hands braced on the polished wood. "She and I were just reminiscing, about old times, about old friends, about your father." He paused, letting the name hang in the air, a heavy, accusatory weight. "Your father was a great man," he continued, his cold blue eyes fixed on my son, "a man of profound integrity. He was my mentor, my friend. He took a poor kid from the South Side with nothing but a scholarship and a cheap suit, and he treated him like a son. He and your mother, they opened their home to me. They fed me. They believed in me. I owe them a debt I can never truly repay." He looked from me to Jonathan, and his expression was one of deep personal and utterly profound disappointment. And now, I look at you, his son, a man who was given everything I had to fight for, a man who is about to be made a partner in my firm, and I have to ask myself, is this his legacy? Is this the man Robert Greene raised? Miss Davenport, I don't understand, Jonathan stammered, his mind scrambling to process the impossible situation he had just walked into. His two worlds, the world of his domestic tyranny and the world of his professional ambition, had just collided with the force of a supernova. Don't you? Miss Davenport said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. Then let me make it perfectly clear for you. He reached into a folder on his desk and pulled out a single sheet of paper. He held it up. It was a high-quality color printout of the photograph I had sent him. A photograph of my face, the ugly purple and blue bruise around my eyes stark and undeniable, even in the soft, forgiving light of his office. Your mother tells me a very interesting story, Jonathan, he said, his voice dripping with an icy, controlled rage. She tells me this is the result of a disagreement over a bowl of soup. An unseasoned bowl of soup. Is that your version of events as well? Jonathan stared at the photograph of his own handiwork, and the last vestigial traces of color drained from his face. He turned as pale as chalk. He looked from the photo to me, and in my calm, unyielding gaze he finally saw the truth. There were no more lies. There was no more hiding. The monster he had kept so safely locked away at home had just followed him to work, and it was about to devour him whole. The photograph lay on the polished surface of Mr. Davenport's desk, a small, square and utterly damning indictment. It was a silent witness, but its testimony was louder, more powerful and more irrefutable than any spoken word. Jonathan stared at it, his face a mask of pure, slack-jawed horror, the carefully constructed facade of his life. The image of the successful, charismatic golden boy had just been incinerated in the face of this one ugly, undeniable truth. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a frantic, pleading panic. He was searching for an escape route, a lie, an explanation that could somehow contain this catastrophe, but he found nothing in my expression but a quiet, sorrowful finality. I was not there to rescue him, I was there to bear witness to his judgment. It's not what it looks like, he stammered, the words clumsy and unconvincing. She fell. She's been falling a lot lately. She's not well. She gets confused. She makes things up. He was trying to deploy the same lie he had used so effectively on me, on the hospital staff. But he was no longer speaking to a tired resident or a sympathetic nurse. He was speaking to Charles Davenport, a man who had spent 40 years deconstructing the lies of the most powerful and deceptive people in the city. And he was speaking to me, the author of the lie itself. Mr. Davenport let out a short, sharp and utterly contemptuous laugh. Confused, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Oh, I have no doubt that she is. I would be confused too if my own son beat me and then tried to convince the world I was crazy. But your mother, Jonathan, is many things. She is brilliant. She is kind. She is one of the strongest women I have ever known. But she is not confused. And she is not a liar. He picked up the phone on his desk. Margaret, he said into the receiver, please send in Dr. Ramirez. A moment later, a side door in the office, one Jonathan had never even noticed, opened, and a sharp, intelligent-looking woman in a crisp suit entered. Dr. Ramirez is the city's leading forensic psychologist, Mr. Davenport explained, his voice dangerously calm. She's also an old friend. She was kind enough to pay your mother a visit this morning, at my request. They had a long, very illuminating chat. Dr. Ramirez looked at Jonathan with a cool, clinical and deeply unsettling gaze. Mr. Greene, she said, her voice calm and professional. Based on my 2-hour in-depth evaluation, I can say with absolute professional certainty that your mother is not only 100% mentally competent, but she shows no signs of dementia, confusion, or any other cognitive impairment. In fact, she displays a remarkable level of psychological resilience. She does, however, display all the classic signs of a victim of prolonged domestic abuse and gaslighting. Every word was a nail being hammered into the coffin of Jonathan's life. The lie he had so carefully constructed, the weapon he had wielded with such cruel efficiency, had just been expertly and systematically by a team of professionals he had not even known existed. So let's stop with the stories, shall we, Jonathan? Miss Davenport said, his voice now a low, menacing growl. He leaned across his desk, his eyes burning with a righteous, protective fury. Let's talk about the truth. Let's talk about what kind of man, what kind of son, beats his own mother because her soup wasn't salted to his liking. The directness of the question, the sheer ugly simplicity of it, seemed to finally break him. The last of his defenses crumbled. He staggered back, collapsing into the leather armchair he had been offered just minutes before, his face in his hand. A low, guttural sob, the sound of a man's entire world ending, was torn from his throat. The unveiling was complete. The monster was, at last, I sat and watched my son's complete and utter unraveling with a strange, profound sense of detachment. The weeping, broken man in the armchair was a stranger to me, a consequence of his own terrible choices. The primal maternal instinct to rush to him to comfort him was gone, burned out of me by the violence of his betrayal. All I felt was a vast, cold, and deeply sorrowful emptiness. Mr. Davenport, however, was not finished. This was not just a professional matter for him. This was deeply, profoundly personal. He was not just a managing partner, he was a man repaying a debt of honor to the memory of his mentor and to the woman sitting in his office. He walked around his desk and stood before Jonathan, looking down at his pathetic, sobbing form with an expression of pure, unadulterated contempt. "You know," he began, his voice a low, conversational, and utterly terrifying murmur. "When I was a student, your father and I used to have long talks. We'd sit in his office, surrounded by books, and he would talk about the law. He believed the law was a sacred thing, a shield to protect the innocent and a sword to punish the wicked. He believed that a man's character was the only true measure of his worth." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Your mother, she was the embodiment of that character. She was the kindest, most generous woman I had ever met. I was a scholarship kid, Jonathan. I had one suit to my name, and it was 2 sizes too small. I used to eat at your parents' house at least twice a week, because I couldn't always afford to eat on my own. Your mother would pack me leftovers to take back to my dorm. She never made me feel like a charity case. She just made me feel like family." He looked over at me, and for a fraction of a second his hard, angry expression softened with a flicker of old, deep affection and gratitude. Then he turned his gaze back to my son, and his face was a mask of cold, hard fury. "I owe this life," he said, gesturing with a sweep of his hand at the vast, opulent office, at the city sprawling beneath them, to their belief in me, to the foundation they helped me build. And for the past 15 years I have tried to repay that debt by taking you under my wing, by mentoring you, by giving you opportunities you did not have to fight for. I saw you as an extension of your father, as a continuation of his legacy. I see now that I was a fool." He leaned down, his face just inches from Jonathan's, his voice dropping to a harsh, venomous whisper. "You are not your father's son, you are a disgrace to his memory. You took the legacy of kindness and integrity he gave you, and you twisted it into this ugly, violent, pathetic excuse for a man. You have taken your mother's unconditional love and used it as a weapon against her. You are a cancer in your own family." He straightened up, his face a mask of cold, final judgment. "The debt I owe your parents, Jonathan, is one I can never truly repay. But I can make a down payment on it today. And that down payment begins with ensuring that you face the consequences of your actions." He walked back to his desk, his movements calm and decisive. "You are of course fired. Effective immediately. Your access to the building has been revoked. Security will escort you out. I will also be making a formal report of this assault to the Chicago Police Department. And I will be personally submitting a file on your conduct to the Illinois State Bar Association. I imagine they will be very interested to hear about a lawyer who engages in domestic battery. Your career, the one you valued more than your own mother's safety, is over. The debt was repaid, not with money but with justice. A swift, brutal, and utterly comprehensive justice that was about to strip my son of everything he held dear." Jonathan finally looked up, his face a mess of tears and disbelief. The full, catastrophic scope of his ruin was finally dawning on him. It wasn't just the partnership, it was everything. His job, his reputation, his future. It had all been incinerated in the space of 15 minutes. "No," he whispered, shaking his head, a cornered animal looking for an escape that did not exist. "You can't, Mr. Davenport. Please. It was a mistake. A one-time thing. I was under so much pressure. A mistake," I said, my voice cutting through his pathetic, sniveling excuses. It was the first time I had spoken since he'd entered the room. My voice was not loud. It was not angry. It was the quiet, clear, and utterly unshakable voice of a judge delivering a finding of fact. When you strike a person, that is an action. When you do it to your own mother, a woman half your size, that is a choice. And when you demand that she cover her bruises and lie for you so you can impress your wife, that is not a mistake, Jonathan, that is a revelation of your character. I stood up from my chair and walked to Mr. Davenport's desk. I picked up the printed photograph of my bruised face. I held it out for him to see, forcing him to look at the undeniable, ugly truth of what he had done. This, I said, my voice trembling with a cold, controlled fury, is who you are. This is the man you have become. Not the brilliant lawyer, not the successful son. This, a bully, a coward, a man who raises his hand to his own mother because his soup is not to his liking. He flinched as if I had struck him, recoiling from the photograph as if it were a hot iron. He buried his face in his hands again, a low, guttural sob of pure self-pitying despair tearing from his throat. I loved you, Jonathan, I continued, my voice now a soft, sorrowful whisper that was somehow more devastating than my anger. I loved you more than my own life. I excused your temper. I ignored your coldness. I told myself it was just the pressure of your life. I made 1,000 excuses for the man you were becoming, because I was so desperate to still see the little boy you once were. But that boy is gone. I don't know what you are now, but you are not my son. The finality of those words, the quiet, absolute act of maternal disownment, seemed to be the final blow. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a new, fresh horror. He could lose his job, his career, his reputation, but to lose his mother, that was a loss so profound, so fundamental that his mind could not even begin to comprehend it. It was an amputation of the soul. Mr. Davenport, seeing that the confrontation had reached its terrible necessary conclusion, pressed a button on his intercom. Margaret, he said, his voice calm and businesslike once more, please send security up to my office. Mr. Green will be leaving us now. The battle was over. The verdict had been delivered, and the sentence was about to be carried out. The arrival of the 2 security guards was a quiet, almost surreal affair. They were large, impassive men in sharp suits, their faces devoid of all expression. They entered the opulent office without a word, their presence a silent final confirmation that Jonathan's time in this world of power and prestige was officially over. They stood on either side of his chair. One of them spoke, his voice a low professional murmur. Mr. Green will be escorting you from the building now. Jonathan didn't move. He just sat there, a broken, weeping shell of a man, his face in his hands. He was a king who had just been deposed, and he could not seem to comprehend the reality of his own exile. The guard gently but firmly placed a hand on his shoulder. Sir, he said, his voice a little louder this time. It's time to go. The touch seemed to jolt Jonathan back to reality. He slowly lifted his head, his eyes red-rimmed and empty. He looked at Miss Davenport, who was now standing by the window once more, his back to the room, a silent, implacable figure of judgment. He looked at me and his expression was one of pure, unadulterated despair. He allowed the guards to pull him to his feet. They escorted him from the office, a fallen prince being led from the castle. He didn't say another word, he didn't beg, he didn't protest. The fight was gone from him, replaced by the hollow, shuffling gait of a man who had just lost everything. After he was gone, a profound and heavy silence settled over the room. Mr. Davenport turned from the window. His face was etched with a deep, weary sorrow. Martha, he said, his voice soft, I am so sorry, for all of it. You have nothing to be sorry for, Charles, I replied, my own voice trembling slightly. You just repaid a debt that was 40 years old. You did what Robert would have done. You stood up for me. He was like a son to me, he said, shaking his head in disbelief. I never saw it. The arrogance. Yes. The ambition. But not this. Not the monster. The monster was saved for me, I said, a bitter hollow laugh escaping my lips. He was always the perfect son to the rest of the world. The ruin was absolute. As Mr. Davenport had promised, he made the calls. The report was filed with the police. The file was submitted to the bar. Jonathan's photograph, which had been featured prominently on the firm's website as a rising star, was quietly removed. His name was erased. The news of his sudden, shocking departure from the firm sent ripples through the Chicago legal community. The official story was a bland, corporate statement about personal reasons. But the rumors, the whispers began to circulate, and in a world built on reputation, a whisper is as good as a conviction. His financial world imploded. Without his massive salary, the loans he had taken out for his lavish lifestyle were suddenly unpayable. The beautiful, perfect life he had built with Victoria, a life built on a foundation of his future earnings, was a house of cards that came tumbling down. Victoria, I learned later, did not stick around for the aftermath. The moment she heard he had been fired, that the partnership, the money, the entire future she had bet on, was gone, she had packed her bags. Theirs had not been a marriage of love. It had been a merger, and the merger had just been dissolved in a hostile takeover. She was gone from his life within 24 hours. Another casualty of his own self-destruction. He was left with nothing. No job, no wife, no reputation, and no mother. He was alone, in the ruins of a life he had so arrogantly and so violently destroyed. I returned to my brownstone that evening a different woman. The house was the same, the quiet, orderly rooms just as I had left them, but I was not. The fearful, anxious woman who had cowered in her room, who had painstakingly applied a mask of lies to her bruised face, was gone forever. I walked through my home, and the quiet no longer felt brittle or fragile. It felt peaceful. It felt like mine again. Mr. Davenport had insisted on sending his personal driver to take me home, and had arranged for one of his firm's security consultants to sweep the house, to change the locks, to ensure my absolute and total safety. That evening, as I sat in my living room, a cup of chamomile tea in my hand, Mr. Davenport came to visit. He did not come as a powerful lawyer, but as an old friend. He brought with him a bag of groceries and a quiet, comforting presence. "The police will be by in the morning to take your official statement," he said, his voice gentle. "You don't have to do it if you're not ready." "I'm ready," I said, my voice clear and strong. "I was a victim. I will not be silent. I will not be ashamed." He nodded, a look of profound respect in his eyes. The next day was a day of cleansing. A police officer, a kind, patient woman, came and took my statement. I told her everything, the words coming out not in a torrent of emotion, but in a calm, factual and utterly damning narrative. Later that day, Mr. Davenport arranged for a moving company to come to the house. Under the discreet supervision of his security men, all of Jonathan's belongings, his expensive suits, his polished shoes, his cold modern furniture were packed into boxes. I watched from an upstairs window as the men loaded the boxes into a truck, carrying away the last physical remnants of his presence in my home. It was like an exorcism. As the moving truck pulled away from the curb, I felt the last of the fear, the last of the suffocating tension, leave with it. The house was mine again, the quiet was mine again, the life was mine again. I knew the road ahead would be long, the bruise on my face would fade, but the wound on my heart, the one left by the betrayal of my own son, might never truly heal. There would be legal proceedings. There would be difficult days. But I was not a victim anymore. I was a survivor. I walked into my kitchen, the heart of my home. The bowl of uneaten soup was still on the counter from that terrible night. I picked it up, carried it to the sink, and poured it down the drain. I washed the bowl, my movements slow and deliberate, and placed it back on the shelf. The house was clean, the future was unwritten, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt a flicker of something I had thought was lost to me forever. I felt a flicker of peace.